I never thought I'd be thrown out of a boardroom by someone who wasn't even old enough to legally drink. But that Tuesday morning, I learned exactly what happens when an arrogant brat thinks power is untouchable. As Andrew Wakefield Jr., the smug face dismissed me from the leadership meeting I'd been running for 3 years. I felt that familiar flash of helplessness. Then came the clarity. Because, unlike him, I'd been preparing for this moment for months. My name is Elizabeth Monroe. And at 36, I'd clawed my way up to Regional Finance Director at Sterling and Wakefield Holdings, one of the most ruthless global finance firms on Wall Street. I'd survived 3 market crashes, 2 corporate restructures, and countless backstabbing colleagues who thought a woman in finance was just temporary decoration. What I hadn't survived was Andrew Wakefield Jr. The morning it all went to hell started like any other Tuesday. I was presenting quarterly risk assessments to the senior leadership team when the conference room door burst open. In walked Andrew Jr., 21 years old, still smelling like last night's expensive scotch, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had that particular brand of arrogance that only comes from never having to earn anything in your life. "Sorry I'm late," he announced, not sounding sorry at all. "Dad wanted me to sit in on this." He dropped into the chair at the head of the table, my chair, where I'd been conducting this meeting for the past 3 years. Charles Wakefield, our CEO and Andrew's father, gave me an apologetic shrug from across the room. But I saw the resignation in his eyes. He'd already surrendered to whatever his son wanted, and we both knew it. As I was saying, I continued, keeping my voice steady, the derivatives exposure in our European portfolio requires immediate. Actually, Andrew Jr. interrupted, scrolling through his phone. "I think we need to talk about staff restructuring first. There are some changes coming that everyone should know about." The room went silent. I felt every pair of eyes bounce between us like spectators at a tennis match. Andrew Jr. wasn't just interrupting my presentation. He was dismantling my authority in front of the entire leadership team. "This is a finance meeting. Andrew," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "We can discuss staffing after we address the $12 million exposure that needs immediate attention." He finally looked up from his phone, those cold blue eyes meeting mine with undisguised contempt. "I think you're confused about how this works now. I'm VP of Strategic Development. That means I decide what gets discussed and when." The title was bullshit, a made-up position his father had created to give him something to do. But the power behind it was real, and everyone in that room knew it. "Elizabeth," Charles spoke up weakly, "perhaps we could table the risk assessment and—" "No." The word came out harder than I'd planned. $12 million doesn't wait for anyone's convenience. Andrew Jr. smiled then, and I knew I'd just made a fatal mistake. "You know what? You're right. It shouldn't wait." He stood up, straightening his tie with deliberate slowness. "Which is why you're dismissed from this meeting. Effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. 20 years of building respect, credibility, and authority, gone in an instant because Daddy's boy decided he didn't like being challenged. But as I gathered my papers and walked toward the door, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Because unlike everyone else in that room, I'd been preparing for this moment, and Andrew Wakefield Jr. had no idea what was coming. Andrew Wakefield Jr. had been a cancer spreading through Sterling and Wakefield for exactly 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. I'd been counting because that's when Charles made the catastrophic decision to bring his son into the company as Vice President of Strategic Development, a title that meant absolutely nothing and gave him access to absolutely everything. The kid had never worked a day in his life. His resume was a joke. Dropped out of Harvard Business School after 1 semester, spent 2 years finding himself in Europe on Daddy's credit card, and somehow convinced Charles that his trust fund lifestyle qualified him to make strategic decisions for a multi-billion-dollar firm. From day one, Andrew Jr. treated the office like his personal playground. He'd stroll in around noon, demand reports that took teams weeks to compile, then ignore them completely. He'd interrupt client calls to ask if we had better coffee somewhere, He'd schedule mandatory meetings that he'd skip, leaving entire departments sitting in conference rooms waiting for someone who was probably getting a massage at his private club. But the real problem wasn't his incompetence, it was his delusion. He genuinely believed he was next in line to run the company, and he wanted everyone to know it. He'd make sweeping declarations about new directions and innovative strategies that would have bankrupted us in 6 months. When senior staff tried to explain why his ideas wouldn't work, he'd dismiss them with a wave of his hand and mutter something about old thinking. I tried to manage him at first. Professional courtesy, right? His father was my boss. And I figured I could guide the kid through some basic business principles, maybe teach him enough to keep him from destroying what we'd built. I was wrong. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during our quarterly review. Andrew Jr. had been sitting in on department meetings all week, taking notes on his phone and asking questions that proved he understood nothing about finance, operations, or basic human decency. I've been thinking, he announced to my team, we need to make some changes around here, starting with the International Accounts Division. That division had just closed a deal that saved the company $4.8 million. They'd worked 18-hour days for 2 months, navigating complex regulatory requirements across 3 countries. It was the kind of success that keeps companies alive during market downturns. What kind of changes? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. Well, they made me look stupid in yesterday's client presentation, asked all these technical questions I couldn't answer, made it seem like I didn't know what I was talking about. He paused, completely oblivious to the irony. So I think we should clean house. Get rid of the whole team and start fresh with people who understand how to support leadership. The room went dead silent. My team stared at him like he'd just suggested we burn the building down for insurance money. Andrew, I said carefully, that team just saved us nearly $5 million. They're the best international accounts group on the East Coast. Yeah, well, loyalty matters more than numbers. He stood up, adjusting his cufflinks with that smug expression I'd grown to hate. I want termination papers drawn up by Friday, all of them. That's when I stopped playing nice. No. Excuse me? I said no. I won't fire my best team because you're embarrassed that they know more about their jobs than you do. The kid's face went red. Nobody had ever said no to him before, not about anything that mattered. You work for my father. My father works for me. Do the math. Your father works for the board of directors and the shareholders. You work for nobody because you've never actually done anything. I kept my voice level, professional. And I won't destroy good people's careers to protect your ego. Andrew Jr. stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a threatening whisper. Dad's going to fire you. Don't forget who really runs this place. But as he stormed out of the conference room, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid anymore, because for the past 3 months, while everyone else was tiptoeing around Daddy's boy, I'd been building something much more powerful than his temper tantrums. I'd been building a case. The call came at 7:30 a.m. the next morning. Charles Wakefield's assistant, her voice carefully neutral, requested my presence in the CEO's office at 9 a.m. sharp. No explanation, no agenda, just the kind of summons that everyone in corporate America knows means your career is about to end. I arrived 5 minutes early, as always. Charles was standing by his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline like he was searching for answers in the glass and steel. When he turned around, I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes. Shame. Elizabeth, please sit down. His voice was tired, defeated. I'm going to get straight to the point because we both know why you're here. I remained standing. Do we? Yesterday's incident with Andrew has created a situation that requires immediate attention. He couldn't even look at me directly. The board feels it would be best if you took some time away from the office. Temporary suspension, full pay, while we work through this transition period. Transition period? I let the words hang in the air between us. Is that what we're calling it when your son throws a tantrum and you fire the person who won't enable him? Charles flinched. It's not permanent, Elizabeth. just until things settle down. You know how much I value your contributions to this company. No, Charles. You valued my contributions right up until they conflicted with your son's ego. I watched him shift uncomfortably in his chair. We both know this isn't temporary. You're going to let me disappear quietly so Andrew can play CEO without anyone challenging his authority. He's my son, Charles said quietly, and those 3 words contained everything I needed to know. Blood was thicker than competence, loyalty, or even basic business sense. He's also going to destroy everything you've built here. I moved toward the door, then paused. But you already know that, don't you? You're just hoping someone else will clean up the mess after you're gone. As I reached for the door handle, Charles spoke again. Elizabeth, I need you to understand. I understand perfectly. I turned back to face him one last time. You're choosing your son over your company. You're choosing his feelings over the livelihoods of hundreds of employees. You're choosing convenience over integrity. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. I opened the door, then delivered the words I'd been holding back for months. But here's what you don't understand. Charles, your son isn't just incompetent, he's dangerous. And while you've been protecting him from consequences, I've been protecting this company from him. I saw confusion flicker across his face. What do you mean? I mean that while Andrew has been playing dress-up CEO, I've been documenting every illegal shortcut, every regulatory violation, every financial manipulation he's pushed through this office. I let that sink in for a moment. And unlike you, I didn't choose family over duty. The color drained from Charles's face. Elizabeth, if you're threatening, I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply stating facts. I stepped into the hallway, my hand still on the doorframe. You wanted to know why I wasn't afraid when Andrew tried to intimidate me yesterday? It's because I've been preparing for this conversation since the day you brought him into this company. What are you saying? I'm saying that firing me won't make Andrew's problems disappear. It will just remove the person who's been quietly fixing them. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Good luck explaining that to the board when they start asking questions about those quarterly reports. As I walked down the hallway toward the elevator, I heard Charles call my name. But I didn't turn around, because for the first time in months, I knew exactly what came next. And it wasn't going to be pretty for the Wakefield family. The truth was, I'd been building my case against Andrew Wakefield Jr. since his second week on the job, not out of malice, out of necessity. Because within days of his arrival, it became clear that Daddy's boy wasn't just incompetent. He was reckless in ways that could bring down the entire company. It started with small things. Andrew would override risk assessments without reading them, approve expenditures that violated our compliance protocols, and make promises to clients that we couldn't legally fulfill. At first, I thought it was just inexperience. I'd quietly fix his mistakes, adjust the paperwork, and hope he'd learn from observation. But then I realized he wasn't making mistakes. He was making decisions. Bad ones, dangerous ones. And when those decisions started involving falsified reports and manipulated financial data, I knew I had to act. The first smoking gun came in week 3. Andrew had instructed our accounting department to adjust our quarterly numbers to make his new initiatives look more successful than they actually were. When the lead accountant, Maria Santos, brought me the original reports alongside Andrew's corrections, I saw exactly what we were dealing with. He told me to make the numbers more optimistic, Maria said, her hands shaking as she laid out the documents. But this isn't optimistic. It's fraud. I made copies of everything that night, storing them in a secure folder on a server Andrew didn't know existed. Then I started paying closer attention to every decision he made, every email he sent, every meeting he held. The evidence piled up faster than I'd expected. Andrew was signing contracts without proper legal review, creating financial obligations that violated federal regulations, and instructing staff to bypass mandatory compliance checks. He'd taken our carefully constructed risk management protocols and turned them into suggestions. But I wasn't working alone. 2 weeks into my investigation, I was approached by Patricia Evans, our Director of Compliance Controls. Patricia had been with the company for 15 years, and she'd noticed the same red flags I had. "We need to talk," she said, appearing at my office door after hours, "about Andrew's creative interpretation of SEC regulations." Patricia had her own collection of evidence, emails where Andrew explicitly told her to find workarounds for federal requirements, documented instances where he'd overridden mandatory waiting periods, and a particularly damning recording of him saying that compliance was just bureaucratic bullshit during a staff meeting. Within days, we had a third ally, Victor Allen, our chief legal counsel. Victor had been quietly documenting Andrew's unauthorized contract modifications and his tendency to make verbal agreements that contradicted our written policies. "The kid's going to get us all indicted," Victor said during one of our clandestine meetings. "He's treating federal law like a suggestion box." Over the next 2 months, the three of us worked systematically to document every violation, every shortcut, every instance where Andrew had put his ego ahead of legal requirements. We created a comprehensive file that detailed not just what he'd done, but the potential legal and financial consequences for the company. We weren't planning a coup. We were building a fortress. Because we all knew that eventually, Andrew's recklessness would catch up with him, and when it did, we needed proof that we'd tried to prevent it. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Charles was protecting his son from consequences, I was protecting the company from his son. And while Andrew was playing power games, I was documenting his crimes. By the time he had me fired, I had enough evidence to bury him. More importantly, I had allies positioned throughout the company who understood that Andrew Wakefield Jr. wasn't just bad for business. He was an existential threat to everything we'd built. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to be patient. And now, patience had run out. The morning I was officially suspended, Patricia Evans and Victor Allen were already in motion. By 10 a.m., exactly 1 hour after Charles Wakefield had shown me the door, a comprehensive report landed on the desk of every member of Sterling & Wakefield's board of directors. The document was 63 pages of cold, methodical evidence, no accusations, no personal grievances, just facts. Financial irregularities with dates and amounts. Regulatory violations with specific statute references. Email threads showing Andrew's explicit instructions to bypass compliance protocols. Audio recordings of him dismissing federal requirements as bureaucratic nonsense. Patricia had crafted the compliance section with surgical precision. Each violation was cross-referenced with the potential penalties, fines ranging from $500,000 to $50 million, possible criminal charges for willful misconduct, and the nuclear option, loss of our federal licensing that would effectively shut down our operations. Victor's legal analysis was equally devastating. He'd identified 17 separate instances where Andrew's actions had created liability exposure for the company, including 3 that could result in personal criminal charges for any executive who knowingly allowed them to continue. But the real masterstroke was the financial impact assessment. I'd calculated the exact cost of each of Andrew's decisions, $2.3 million, in unnecessary penalties, $8.7 million in voided contracts due to improper procedures, and a potential $127 million exposure from the derivatives mess he'd created by ignoring risk protocols. The report went out at 10 a.m. By 10:30, board members were calling emergency meetings. By 11 a.m., the company's external legal counsel was demanding immediate access to all relevant documents. While the board was digesting the evidence, I was activating the second phase of our plan. Global Equities Alliance, our largest international client representing $340 million in annual revenue, received a carefully worded letter expressing concerns about recent operational changes at Sterling & Wakefield. I'd spent 3 years building a personal relationship with GEA's managing director, Sarah Richardson. She trusted my judgment, and when I told her that recent management decisions were creating significant regulatory and financial risks that could impact their portfolios, she took action immediately. The letter Sarah sent to Charles wasn't subtle. We've become aware of concerning changes in Sterling & Wakefield's risk management protocols. Until we receive assurance that these issues have been resolved, We'll be suspending all new investment commitments and reviewing our existing arrangements. 3 other major clients received similar communications. Within hours, Charles was facing a potential loss of over $500 million in client relationships. By noon, the Sterling and Wakefield headquarters was in chaos. Emergency board meetings were called. External auditors were summoned. The company's stock price had dropped 3% on rumors of internal management issues. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, receiving updates from Patricia and Victor via encrypted messages. The beauty of our plan was its simplicity. We weren't destroying the company. We were saving it. Every action we'd taken was designed to force the board to confront the reality they'd been ignoring. Andrew Wakefield Jr. was a liability that could no longer be protected. At 2 p.m., Charles started making desperate phone calls. First to board members, trying to downplay the misunderstandings in the report, then to client executives, attempting damage control. Finally, at 4:17 p.m., he called me. "Elizabeth, we need to talk. This has gone too far." "Has it?" I kept my voice perfectly calm. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it's gone exactly as far as it needed to. The board is asking questions I can't answer. The clients are threatening to pull their accounts. This could destroy everything we've built. No, Charles. Andrew could destroy everything you've built. We're just making sure the board understands that before it's too late. There was a long pause. "What do you want?" "I want you to realize that protecting your son from consequences isn't the same as protecting your company from your son." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. The fortress we'd built was holding, and the walls were closing in on Andrew Wakefield Jr. The call came at 6:47 p.m. Charles Wakefield's voice was hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "Elizabeth, I need to see you. Tonight. Please. I'm suspended, remember? I'm not sure that's appropriate. The board met for 4 hours today. They've asked me to step aside temporarily while they conduct a full investigation." His voice cracked slightly. "Andrew's been relieved of all duties, effective immediately." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. "And they want to meet with you tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. They're calling it a consultation regarding operational continuity, but we both know what it really is." An hour later, I sat across from Charles in his private study, watching a man who'd built a financial empire realize he'd let his son burn it down. The confident CEO was gone, replaced by a father who'd finally understood the cost of unconditional protection. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Known what?" "About Andrew's irregularities. I've known since week 2 that your son was dangerous. I've known since week 3 that he was breaking federal law. And I've known since week 4 that you were going to choose him over everyone else." I leaned forward. "The question is, how long have you known?" Charles looked older than his 62 years. "I suspected something was wrong when the compliance reports started coming back clean too consistently. Andrew's not detail-oriented, but I thought you were handling it." I was fixing his mistakes, covering his liability, protecting the company from his incompetence. I let that sink in. But when he started demanding I fire competent people to protect his ego, I realized I was enabling something worse than incompetence. "You could have come to me." Could I? When every time someone questioned Andrew's decisions, they mysteriously found themselves reassigned or marginalized. I shook my head. "You made it clear that loyalty to your son was more important than loyalty to the company." Charles poured himself a scotch with shaking hands. "The board wants my resignation. They think I knew about the violations and chose to ignore them." "Did you?" I knew he was struggling. I knew he was making mistakes. But I thought... He trailed off. "You thought what? That Daddy's money could fix federal crimes? That your position could protect him from the SEC? I thought I could guide him, teach him, give him time to grow into the role. He's 21 years old. Charles, he's not going to grow into anything. He's going to keep making the same entitled decisions until someone stops him." I stood up. Today, someone finally did. What happens now? Now? The board gets to decide whether Sterling and Wakefield survives your son's mistakes. They get to decide whether they can rebuild client trust, whether they can satisfy federal regulators, whether they can convince the market that this was an isolated incident. And me? You get to decide whether you're going to keep protecting Andrew from consequences, or whether you're going to help clean up the mess he made. Charles met my eyes for the first time all evening. Tomorrow morning, when you meet with the board, what are you going to tell them? I'm going to tell them the truth, that Andrew Wakefield Jr. committed multiple federal violations, created massive liability exposure, and endangered every job in this company. I moved toward the door, and I'm going to tell them that you chose to protect him instead of protecting the people who trusted you. Elizabeth. But I'm also going to tell them that Sterling and Wakefield can be saved, that the violations can be contained, the client relationships can be rebuilt, and the company can move forward. I paused at the door, without Andrew, and probably without you. As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not for revenge, not for personal vindication, but for the company we'd all worked so hard to build. Tomorrow, I'd face the board. Tomorrow, I'd help them understand what needed to be done. Tonight, I'd sleep better than I had in weeks. The boardroom at Sterling and Wakefield had never felt more electric. 12 directors sat around the mahogany table, their faces grave as I walked in at precisely 9 a.m. Board Chairman Margaret Thornton gestured to the seat at the far end, the same chair where Andrew had dismissed me just days earlier. Ms. Monroe, Margaret began, we've reviewed the comprehensive report submitted by Ms. Evans and Mr. Allen. We'd like to hear your assessment of the situation. I didn't need notes. I'd been preparing for this moment for months. The violations documented in that report represent systemic failures that endangered every aspect of this company's operations. Andrew Wakefield Jr. didn't just make mistakes. He made deliberate decisions to circumvent federal regulations, manipulate financial data, and ignore compliance protocols. I looked each board member in the eye. The question isn't whether these actions occurred. The question is whether Sterling and Wakefield can survive them. For the next hour, I laid out the reality they'd been avoiding, the SEC investigation that was inevitable, the client relationships that hung in the balance, the regulatory penalties that could cripple our operations. But I also presented solutions, concrete steps to contain the damage, rebuild trust, and ensure nothing like this could happen again. The company can be saved, I concluded, but only if we're willing to make the hard decisions that should have been made months ago. Margaret leaned forward. What would you recommend? Immediate termination of Andrew Wakefield Jr.'s employment, full cooperation with regulatory investigations, comprehensive audit of all transactions he influenced, and leadership changes that demonstrate our commitment to ethical operations? The vote was unanimous. Andrew Wakefield Jr. was terminated effective immediately, with no severance package and no references. Charles Wakefield was given the option to resign quietly or face a public termination. He chose resignation. 2 hours later, I stood before the entire Sterling and Wakefield staff. The same people who'd watched Andrew humiliate me in that conference room now listened as I outlined our path forward. Over the past few months, some of you have been asked to compromise your professional standards to accommodate poor leadership. That ends today. I looked across the room, making eye contact with Maria Santos, with the international accounts team Andrew had tried to fire, with every person who'd been marginalized for doing their job correctly. No one in this company will ever again be asked to choose between their integrity and their employment. The applause was immediate and sustained, but what mattered more was what I saw in their faces: relief, hope, and something that had been missing for months: respect for leadership that had been earned rather than inherited. Within a week, Global Equities Alliance had renewed their full commitment to Sterling and Wakefield. Other clients followed suit. The SEC investigation continued, but our cooperation and transparency had minimized the penalties. Andrew Wakefield Jr. never worked in finance again. Last I heard, he was managing a restaurant in Connecticut, a position his father had arranged through family connections. Some people never learn. But I'd learned something important through this ordeal. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about protecting the people who matter and proving that competence will always triumph over entitlement. Charles had been right about one thing: I hadn't played alone. But unlike his son, I'd chosen allies based on merit, not birthright. And that made all the difference. Thank you for listening to this story of workplace justice. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what resonates with your own experiences. Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let me know what other stories you'd like to hear about standing up to workplace bullies and corrupt leadership.